The eyeball monster is easily my favorite alien so far in Alien Earth. So officially, it's called Trypanohyncha Ocellus, or just T. Ocellus for short. But most fans just know it as the Eye. Some also call it Eye Blobby. Noah Hawley, the creator of Alien Earth, calls it Eye Midge. So just pick your fighter. And in episode 5, this little nightmare did something nobody expected by going straight for a Xenomorph. And this isn't your typical run-in. It attacked the Xenomorph head-on, fought it to a standstill, and lived to tell the tale. And we all know the body it was using was Shmuel, the engineer. He was even torn apart by the Xeno. But another fascinating thing about the Eye is that it can always jump ship. So if the host dies, it just moves on. And if you think that maybe because of its size it needs only a big host to even stand a chance against the Xenomorph, then you really need to think again. Because the moment it popped out of Shmuel's eye socket, it didn't run, it plunged straight for the Xenomorph again. And you could see the Xeno wasn't having an easy time with it. And whatever the outcome of this brawl was, the fact that something as small as an Ocellus holding its own against this so-called perfect organism should tell you everything you need to know. I also think the reason why a lot of people are now catching on to the Ocellus is largely because, for a very long time, the Xenomorph has always had a very good PR as this apex predator that just doesn't lose it. I mean, sure, in the old Alien vs. Predator movies you had the Yautja hunt them for sport, but that was never canon. The real Alien franchise has always kept the Xeno on top of the pyramid, until now. And I'm not sure if Noah Hawley did that on purpose, but episode 5 shattered that rule. Because when the Eye leapt into battle, it didn't do it out of desperation. It looked like it wanted the fight, which is why it's my favorite scene from the whole episode. But you know what would have sealed the deal? If when the Eye was inside Shmuel and he opened his mouth and then actual human words had come out. That would have been insane. Instead, it sounded more like alien noises. Like it was calling out to the Xenomorph, which I guess technically counts as words. But for me, if it had been a real voice speaking, that would have pushed it over the top. Another thing I found really interesting was when Morrow pulled the gun on Shmuel, while the Eye was still in his body. He actually started backing up. And that's when he was making those sounds, calling the Xeno. So either he was calling the Xenomorph to take Morrow out, or he was calling it so he could fight it himself. Whichever way you read it, it shows just how intelligent or unpredictable this thing really is. Another thing everyone needs to keep in mind is that the Eye didn't lose. It wasn't sliced in half, and it didn't get dissolved in acid blood. It hung on long enough and fought hard enough that you could actually see the Xenomorph struggling. Also, when Shmuel's body, which was already being controlled by the Eye, got impaled by the Xenomorph during their clash, the Eye itself responded, meaning it wasn't just riding passively. It felt the damage and reacted, showing it experiences pain signals through its host. That's important because it means it's not some detached parasite. It's wired in deep enough that injury to the body it's controlling hits back at it. But then eventually, I guess, it managed to shake the Eye off. But that's when it bolted straight towards Zaveri. And I think that's why a lot of people forget the Eye actually won this battle. Because if you're fighting someone and then you run, who's the winner? You see? And honestly, the way the scene was set up also didn't help either. Zaveri was on the other side of the door banging for Morrow to let her in who didn't. So the stakes were sky high. And I think a lot of people's focus went there. And speaking of Zaveri, why did the Eye knock her out but not infect her? At that point, it had already taken Shmuel. You could even see the tentacles pushing through his nose. But with Zaveri, it just knocked her out and there was no transfer. Why? Maybe it already had what it wanted in Shmuel. Or maybe it was something else entirely. We don't know, because they didn't even show us the attack on camera. And that's one of the annoying things about this show. These big, important moments, they keep them off screen. Same thing they did with Wendy's fight against the Xenomorph. We only get to see the aftermath. Maybe they'll give us answers later in the season, but for now, it's just another frustrating blank spot. But anyways, back to the Maginot ship, because a lot of folks watching didn't even clock that the Xenomorph was basically retreating, which means technically the Eye took this round. And let's not forget, this is the same Xeno that Wendy killed later on when they made it to Earth. But you know who's still alive? The Eye, which almost never happens. The only other creatures to stand on equal footing with the Xeno were the Predators, and those stories technically don't count here, which means this tiny eyeball parasite, with its tentacles and pupils darting like it's thinking a mile a minute, has now become the first real in-canon challenger to the Xenomorph's throne. It doesn't kill you, it wears you. So with these specimens, you have the facehugger who implants. The chest burster will just erupt, and then of course the Xenomorph will either kill you fast or slow, but either way it ends your life. But the Eye doesn't do that. It does something worse. The Eye will just use you and turn your body into weapons or skin suits that it can ride around in. It also watches, it thinks, and then it pounces. Also in episode 4, Boy Cavalier brushed off the idea of giving Yutani her creatures back. His point was basically, why risk it when you could wake up one day with a xenomorph in your belly? And sure, that's a fair fear. But maybe the thing he should really be worried about isn't the xeno at all. Maybe it's the eye. Because then, here's the thing. Everything we've seen about the eye shows it isn't just some parasite. It's very smart. Smart enough to know who matters most in the room, which means it could pick its host strategically. And if that's the case, someone like Boy Cavalier, the guy pulling all the strings, could easily end up being the one it targets. And unlike other specimens, it doesn't implant an embryo into you or tear you apart for food. It goes for the eye socket, burrows into the optic pathways, and hijacks the nervous system, and that means the person is gone in an instant, but their body isn't. The parasite sits in the skull and drives the host like a skin suit, so you have your arms, legs, and voice, all turned into a puppet show. I think that's why it's more horrifying than the xenomorph. I mean, with death you can process. Even the nightmare of a chestburster at least ends with a corpse. But with the eye, your friend could still be standing there, moving and reaching out, except it's not them anymore. And I know some people will say, well, you'd be able to tell, right? Because when the eye pierces into the socket, there's usually some blood. Not pouring out constantly, but enough to show it broke through. But here's the problem. If you don't even know the eye is out there, you're not going to read that as possession. You'll just think the person's hurt or acting off. And by the time you find out, it's too late. Also during the sheep experiment, when Kirsch and Isaac released the eye in a glass box with the sheep, within seconds it tore out the eye, buried itself in the socket, and stood the animal back up like a marionette. And I found that really interesting because it didn't stay like that for long. For a moment it was upright and stiff, almost like it was mimicking a human, and then it dropped back down on all fours. To me, that says maybe it isn't used to being inside an animal. Like it was testing the controls and realizing, nah, maybe this isn't the body I want. It's like it wanted a human host instead. And then of course the monitors even showed the brainwaves change, as if a new operating system had been installed. Another thing I found really interesting was when it went after Nibs in the Maginot when it crushed. Nibs is hybrid with a synthetic body and a human consciousness. And if it wasn't for Nibs literally using her hand to block it, the eye would have yanked her eye out and gone straight in. But then from what we know from the rules of Alien, that shouldn't even be possible. Facehuggers don't care about androids. Chestbursters need blood, heat, and flesh, which means hybrids and machines were supposed to be safe. But the eye broke that rule. And poor Nibs, she came out of that encounter so shaken, she believed she was pregnant. Whether that's just trauma or the first hint of a new kind of implantation, the fact is simple. This monster doesn't care if you're flesh or metal, it'll definitely find a way in. And it makes you wonder, what would have happened if it had actually gotten inside someone like Nibs? Would it pull the eye out and stay there? Could it even survive in a hybrid host? It would have been interesting to see how that plays out. But then Noah Hawley has also said in interviews that all these new creatures are here to stay. He designed them to give Alien the same sense of awful discovery that the Xeno once did. And he specifically leaned on eye trauma because he knew it would hit our instincts harder than chest trauma. We can also all agree that everyone flinches at eye horror. That's why the eye feels like a worse fate. It's designed to make you recoil at the idea of your body being turned into someone else's property. So when you put this all together, the sheep walking on its hind legs, Nibs saying she's pregnant, and the way the eye hijacks the optic nerve and takes over instantly, you realize something. The xenomorph represents fear of death, but the eye represents fear of losing yourself. One is brutal, the other is intimate. And that's why, for many fans, this little eyeball with tentacles has already outshined the iconic monster. Because it doesn't just kill you, it wears you. The knock that proved it thinks. We can't possibly talk about the eye without bringing up that scene with Chibuzo and those blood-sucking parasites, better known as the blood ticks. Because sometimes the scariest moment isn't the big fight, it's the small detail you almost miss. In episode 5, while Chibuzo was studying those blood-sucking parasites, something else happened in the background. And speaking of Chibuzo, with the kind of work she does, she had no business being this incompetent and careless. I mean, how do you work with specimens like these and then forget to secure the lid? Her carelessness set off a whole chain reaction. And then poor Malachite proceeds to drink the water from her thermos, and we all know what happened afterwards. Anyways, back to the eye, because the eye sat in its glass tube, watching. One of the ticks slipped out and crawled into her thermos, and started laying her eggs. And right then, the eye kept knocking on the glass. If you really pay attention, you'll notice the eye didn't just bang around randomly. It actually rubbed 2 of its tentacles together and used them to knock harder on the glass. And that tells you something. It wasn't just flailing. It understood that using more force would get more impact. That's strategy and pure intelligence. Now people go back and forth on what that meant. Some say it was trying to warn her, others say it was just trying to distract her. And honestly, if it was a distraction, it worked. Because we all know what happened after. But if it really was a warning, then once again, Chibuzo proved how incompetent she was. Because she completely missed it. And to really show off the eye's intelligence, one of the clearest signs is in the way it thinks before it moves. You can see its problem solving right there. And if there's any scene that proves it, it's how it escaped that glass container. It studied the glass, tested it, and checked for weak points. And when Chibuzo, once again, didn't secure the case properly, that was its chance. The eye latched onto something inside the glass with its tentacles, braced its body, and shoved until the whole thing toppled over and shattered. And honestly, who thought a fragile glass box was a good idea for housing something like this? Especially an alien. I mean, sure, maybe they didn't fully realize what they were dealing with or how smart this thing was, but still it makes no sense. But the point is, this wasn't luck. This wasn't just random thrashing. This was near human cognition. The eye is a predator that studies its environment, thinks it through, and then makes its move.